Welcome to our fourth fairy tale seminar. We have been delighted to see this coming along as well as it has. We have had some wonderful presenters and just great topics with this. This is number 4 of our five series for the psychology of fairy tales, and we have one more, of course, after this. Today is John Hill, Jungian analyst from Zurich. We are delighted to have John here. Many of you have seen him on other projects that we have done. John does just a delightful job, and we're so pleased to have him today. John will be our main presenter. Murray Stein is with us as well. He will be a panelist, adding pieces here and there, but John Hill is the main presenter today. I'm your host. You may hear me come in and out for some questions, but fairly minimal. Ryan Deegan is the man behind the screen. Will be helping with any technical issues and running the slides today. We have quite a number of countries joining us today. I probably won't read them all off as I usually do, because there's quite a few and you want to jump into John's presentation. But you can see just a wide range of countries joining us. This is a 90-minute seminar, as most of them are now. You can ask questions by two mechanisms. One is by typing in the chat question box that's on the computer screen. You can also email us questions to info@ashevillejungcenter.org. Questions we try to get to as much as we're able, but you realize with a 90-minute seminar and so much material, sometimes questions might get pushed off to the following seminar. Murray will often bring in a question after the fact with that, but if we have time, we will try to get some questions in. We always enjoy that when we're able to. Do make sure that your audio settings are correct. There are two choices on your computer. There's microphone and speaker and telephone. If the telephone is clicked, you won't hear any audio unless you are calling in by the telephone. You can do that if needed, but most people seem to do better with the computer and microphone speakers. But make sure you've configured your audio settings correctly. A couple other things just to let you know briefly. There's a full screen mode, which you'll want to take advantage of. Make sure to click on that. You can also enlarge the presenter and the video versus the slides. You can make the presenter bigger or smaller, and as you do that, the slide correspondingly becomes bigger or smaller. So feel free to go back and forth with that. Our next and final event in the series will be Fairy Tale Seminar number 5. John Hill is also going to be featured in that one as well. I believe Murray is going to participate somewhat also if possible, and that will be our closing seminar in this series. We are taping today. There will be a recorded version of this available. If you would like to be anonymous in your question, just say so in it, and I won't read off your name. But if you're okay and your name's included, I'll let people know who you are. John Hill barely needs an introduction to our Asheville Jung Center crowd. He has presented on numerous occasions with us. He has been a Jungian analyst since 1973, trained at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich. He's currently faculty at the ISAP, International School of Analytical Psychology, Zurich. Recently published a book called At Home in the World, Sounds and Symmetries of Belonging. Fabulous book. I believe Spring Journal Publications published that, but you see the cover there. I can't recommend that one enough. So without further ado, we will turn this over briefly to Murray, who will then turn it mainly to John.
Thanks, Dave. As you said, John Hill doesn't need much of an introduction to this audience, but I would like to say a few words about him and about this seminar series. This is a series on psychological interpretation of fairy tales, psychology of fairy tales, and specifically Jungian interpretations of fairy tales. At the outset, I said we would try to answer 3 questions, among other things. First, why do Jungians study fairy tales, work with them? Secondly, how do Jungians interpret fairy tales? And third, how do we, as Jungian analysts, use fairy tales in our clinical or practical sense? And we attempted to answer some of those questions in the first 3 seminars. The first one, you remember, I gave an outline of Mary Louise von Franz's method for working with fairy tales, the various steps that she recommends if we want to understand fairy tales psychologically. And I applied those to a Grimm's fairy tale called The White Snake. In the second seminar, we looked at C.G. Jung's interpretation of a fairy tale, the spirit, Mercurius, the spirit in the bottle, a Grimm's fairy tale, and also at an original fairy tale that he actually wrote and includes in the Red Book. And then in the third seminar, we looked at Erich Neumann's interpretation of an ancient fairy tale, Amor and Psyche, and went through his interpretation discussion of that. Now we're going to shift gears, and John Hill is going to give a much more personal view and account of a Jungian working with fairy tales. John has been very actively engaged in teaching fairy tale seminars at the Jung Institute in Zurich originally, and now at ISEP in Zurich. And he has a program of working with fairy tales using psychodrama, which is very, very powerful and very popular among the students at ISEP. And he will give us some insight and introduction into how he works with fairy tales and why he continues to work with fairy tales. So without saying anything further, I think that's enough, John, to turn it over to you, and let's hear your approach and your feelings about working with fairy tales. John?
Okay, thank you, Murray, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be able to present on fairy tales. Just going to make sure that I get the right size, because when you all get too small, you look like fairies. And then I get a sense of unreality. I'm just trying to make that a little bit bigger, the picture. I'll get it now. Yeah, doesn't work. Okay, I guess I'll have to. Well, I just have to. Oh, there I go now. Yeah, thank you. Sorry for that delay. So now everybody's sort of a little bit larger. Now, actually, one of the reasons why I do what's called fairy tale drama which is a combination of fairy tales and psychodrama, is because I've felt that the landscape of fairy tales is important. And sometimes that gets lost if we go too quickly into an interpretation. Now, I grew up in Ireland, and Ireland, to a certain extent, in itself is a bit of a fairy tale, which I hope to explain. First of all, I was in a private school for about 6 years, from, let's say, my 5th year to my 11th year. And there were only 5 or 6 pupils, run by a German baron and baroness who fled Germany in the Nazi period. Now, this place where this school was at the back of Beyonds. It was a lovely old house surrounded by marshlands and lakes and rivers. And so we would play in this environment, making even fairy forts. So using sods of earth and building passageways and making round edifices in the midst of marshlands. But one of the fairy tale factors was our neighbors who lived about a mile away, because there was nothing else. And these were 7 brothers. They were known as the Old William brothers. And we heard that one of them only had 1 arm, another had only 1 leg, another had only 1 eye, etc., etc., and one had no mind at all. There was one, though, who was normal, and only he we could greet. So although we never saw these creatures, they became fantasy figures. And so when we build our forts, we would be very wary that will these old strange figures appear and bewitch us, change us into snakes, dragons, or whatever. So that was one aspect of where fairy tales became for me very real in that sort of mythological landscape of childhood. Another factor was that the Baron every evening would read us stories, fairy tale stories. And one of them, known as The King of Ireland's Son, written by, I think, Padraig Colum, lasted, it's a whole book, so it's a fairy tale that runs through a whole book, and that lasted several months. So you can imagine in sort of candlelight, reading and listening to these tales, the fairy tales became magical. They brought us into a landscape, an imaginative, mythical landscape that was very different from what we call reality. Now, I think that corresponds to one phase of a child's upbringing, what I would call the post-Oedipal phase, or the latency phase, you could say. And in that phase, there are children, I wouldn't say all children, who have the opportunity of letting their imagination run free. And so they develop a very special relationship to their environment. So, for example, trees, they hug trees, the animals are their friends, they talk to the rivers, they imagine nymphs coming out of the rivers, they see figures in the sky. So very quickly they're in and out of, on the one hand, reality, their parents, their brothers, their sisters, their friends, and then suddenly it switches and they get into this sort of natural way of seeing the spirits in nature. Something is mysterious in a tree, in a stone, in a river. And so they begin to talk with these elements of nature. And I think that corresponded certainly to an aspect of my own childhood. And that was one of the reasons why in fairy tale drama, I shifted a bit from more an interpretation of the fairy tale, although sometimes, of course, I use that, and I even use that now in fairy tale drama, but especially to creating a fairy tale landscape, so that people are actually in another landscape and they're imagining what the fairy tale could possibly be. Not just the words that are actually said, but what is constellated in their unconscious and in their souls. So, another thing I would like to say is that growing up in Ireland, Ireland, as I said, is something of a mythological landscape. So, for example, if you take a plane across Ireland, you will notice these round circles everywhere. Things that were once all over Europe, probably, but have disappeared in Europe, have still survived in Ireland. Most of these edifices, these circles, are the remains of megalithic buildings or Celtic buildings. And then, yeah, just a note about connections. So this was now why, we have to ask ourselves, why did they survive in Ireland? And one of the reasons was that people thought that they were inhabited by fairies. So fairies were actually next door. And it was very bad luck if you dug up these places or injured them in some way, because that was the abode of the fairies, and they could bring good luck, or if you disturbed them, they could bring bad luck. So, as it were, the fairy world was very close at hand. And I'll give you an example of that quite recently, maybe about 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And that was that the planners of motorways, what you call highways in the States, were building this highway from Galway to Shannon. And they wanted to go as straight as possible. However, there was a place, a special hawthorn tree, which also belongs to the fairies, which was in its way. So, of course, the planner says, okay, we've got to get rid of that tree. However, the locals said, that's a fairy tree. That cannot be touched. So there was a huge fight about this hawthorn bush. And it was believed that the fairies of Limerick, that's down below, and would stop out this hawthorn tree on their travel to visit the fairies in Galway. So, of course, the planners thought this is sheer nonsense, and they went ahead, but the protest then grew further and further, and eventually the whole area rose up and said, no, it's bad luck to dig up a fairy tree. And what happened was that then the planners had to say, okay, we'll divide the two lanes and we'll make a curve around it, costing God knows how many millions. And the result was that you, when you're on that road, you'll see this strange kind of bend. And that's simply because people kept alive the idea of the fairies. Unfortunately, when the road was completed, some guy thought this is just madness. And so what he did was that he went with a hatchet and cut down the tree. So people thought, okay, you can't deal with that kind of mentality. Maybe that is the end of the fairies. But strange enough, even though it was so badly damaged, the next year it grew and blossomed as ever before. So people thought, maybe there's something more to fairies than we usually think about them. Another thing I would like to say about the fairy tale mythological landscape of Ireland. And there's a tale that you probably know of, and it's actually in slide number 4. If you can just go ahead to slide number 4. Let's go slowly. Let's go back over that. I'll explain those things as we go along. Just go back to the, yeah. So that is a quote from Marie-Louise von Franz. And that also was, for me, an inspiration of psychodrama. When an archetype becomes conscious, it's a process of incarnation. Now, psychodrama in itself is a physical, I've suddenly switched off, just a moment. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Somehow I've got to be careful of pressing down the whole time. So psychodrama, I'll come back to the fairy tales, but that quote was very helpful because you don't, in psychodrama, you don't just read the fairy tales, but as I will show later on, it's an enactment. So you feel the fairy tale with your body and with your soul. So once you're enacting the fairy tale, it's a huge constellating factor. Something, the fairy tale itself with the archetypal figures in it actually become alive as you enact the actual fairy tale. So that was that quote. The next quote, let us move on. Well, this is another thing which is an evidence of how the fairy world stayed alive in Ireland. So this is a story of the Blasket Islands, a story from the Blasket Islands. And these were islands off the west coast of Ireland. And it was known for its many storytellers and writers. They kind of just before it was evacuated, because of the very, very difficult life you had on the Blasket Islands. There's hardly enough food, you depended on fish, you depended on import from the mainland. But as the potato crops grew less and less, in the 1950s, it was no longer able to be inhabited and finally was given up. However, just before that happened, there were a lot of people who visited the islands and really encouraged the islanders to write down their stories. And Robin Flower, who was one of these people who visited the island and wrote much about it, an Englishman, he said that the stories from the Blasket Islands are an example of Europe's last Neolithic egg. He felt that the motifs, the images, the narratives came from a time way, way back in history, where the visible and the invisible, the magic and the real all intermixed. So this quote comes from an experience by Thomas O'Dalla, an island man, when he went to his house on Inishtichlan, that's the last island of the Blasket Islands, way off into the Atlantic, as it were. And in the evening, he heard this fairy woman coming. So I'll just read that to give you an example of the strangeness and the eeriness you get in some of this literature. So the fairy woman came to the outside of the house, and she was singing. And I, Thomas, was inside the house. And I had an ear for music. And I had the tune by the morning. So he listened to it over and over again until he could write it down. The woman vanished, and here are the words for it. I am a woman from the fairy host who came over the waves. I was carried off by the night over the sea. I'm in their kingdom, under the control of fairy women. And I shall not be in this world after the cock crows. Then I will go into a fairy fort. It's not a pleasure for me, but there I must go. And all in this world I must leave behind. So you can imagine this kind of tale, and there are many of them, that represent something of the landscape. You know, there's this vast Atlantic Ocean and these offshore islands. And in fact, in Celtic Ireland, it was believed that when someone dies, their soul would go onto these islands and spend a few days there until it was decided what was the next place they should go on to. Like this strange woman who sang this very beautiful song. Unfortunately, I can't sing it for you, but it does exist as a song. So just, it's like, to me, it's an example of a liminal space, a space between reality and something unknown. And I think that's one of the most obvious expressions of Jungian psychology and the individuation process. You're always struggling between what's actually happening in your daily routine and then this other world, the world, what we call now the other world, the world of the imagination, of fairies, witches, dragons, kings, etc. Okay, the next slide. Now, okay, so now I'll come back to the idea of the land itself. The natural landscape is a source of ancestral heritage. As I just said, where these strange objects, they can be fairy forts, they can be odd-shaped rocks, they can be hawthorn trees, they can be caves. But all these objects of the landscape represented something like an epiphany of the fairy world. However, if you look at the mythology, there's more to it than just fairies. So what I just read this, tale, it's a kind of a fairy tale, but it's also a myth. There are many fairy tales that, that have been inspired by it. So this is the story of the 5 sons of King Eochaid. An old king is dying and sends out his 5 sons to find the water of life. The first son comes to a well guarded by an old hag. She will give him the water of life, and he will lie with her, if he will lie with her. He dismisses her, and she refuses him the magic potion. The same happens to the next 3 sons. The 5th son, Niall, consents to lie with her, and the old hag becomes a beautiful young maiden. She calls herself Misha Flatius Naheran. I am the sovereignty of Ireland. She promises to give Niall the kingship of the land. Peace will prevail, and the land will be fertile. The crops shall be manifold, the cows will give forth more milk, and the rivers will be full of fish. So you might see this as an example of a fertility rite, or but there's something more to it than just a fertility right, because the land is not just, the potential to grow crops, for example, to make the land fertile. But in Ireland, that goddess figure represented all that went before. So she in some way represents the fairy world, but also the previous invaders. There's another book in Ireland which is called The Book of Invasions. And in that book, there are various invasions that come from mythological peoples who, eventually the Celts, who invaded and conquered the land. And every time this happens, the previous invader go under the earth and become the fairies. So what we're looking at, some kind of connection between the ancestors and the fairies. So you could say what's really inborn in the hearts of the Irish people was the fairies you must respect, because they are something to do with ancestral heritage. So we have a completely different view of fairies, not just as simply magical creatures, wondrous creatures, but there is a kinship connection, which makes them very real in some way. If you think that these fairies, although you don't know exactly what they are, but they appear as fairies, are in some way connected to your own origins, your own heritage, then you might have different views, and you might understand them in a new way. Okay, so this hag, this old hag, represents all that has been left aside, the barren landscapes, all that is not being attended to by the people. Now, you could say that could represent psychologically all that we suppress, the unconscious, that which we deny. And it emerges again in this tale to say, will you embrace me? Will you embrace me, the barren aspects of your own psyche? And if you do so, then I can make your life blossom with new fruits and new life. So it was a cyclic conception of existence. Things live, die, and be reborn. So that the rightful king, she gives the sovereignty of the land, is one who respects this cyclic nature of things, this process of life and rebirth. That the king usually in this sort of culture represents the culture, the cultural achievement, the achievements of civilization. So what we could say is that the message of this conjunctio, this joining of male and female powers, means that even the king, representing the order of the times, must subject itself to this natural process of life, death, and rebirth. In that way, the ideals of the people gains a significance and a vitality that makes it a convincing power, not only for the peoples of those times, but also, if we think of that purely psychologically, it represents very close to what Jung meant about sort of moving into the unconscious, finding new symbols, so that you become, you could say, invigorated with new ideas, new life. What he calls the transcendent function. Okay, so now, another thing I want to say before I go on to say a little bit more about psychodrama is that you might think that fairy tales and myths are far away. What have they got to do with reality? I mean, it's lovely to have an imagination, but they're actually, do they really change us? What's their significance for today on a cultural level? Well, again, I have to give you the example of Ireland, because there is there's an unbroken continuity in the history of Ireland between these old myths and fairy tales and, you could say, the political developments that led to the independence of Ireland from England. Now, that sounds like a big statement, and there's a lot of material that is between the fairy tale and the political events. But I'll just mention one, and that might help you understand what I'm trying to get across. So now let's go on to the next slide, the next PowerPoint presentation, please. And there might be something in between, and I can go on. Okay, next one. Yes, it's fine. So this is a poem by Padraig Pearse. Now, Padraig Pearse was the founder of the old IRA, also not the present IRA, but the old IRA, that initiated the 1960 revolution. One of you might know about that, but that was a decisive revolution. Its centenary is coming up in a few years. Padraig Pearse, literally, when he heard the name of Cuchulainn, which is one of the great mythological heroes of Ireland, literally knelt down, said a prayer, and vowed that he would sacrifice his life to free Ireland from England. And that event is mirrored in this poem. I'm going to read it to you, and then I will give a short explanation about this. I'm trying to get across this connection between fairy tale, myth, and a political event. I am Ireland. I am Ireland. I am older than the old woman of Barra. Great my glory, I that bore Cuchulainn. Great my shame, my own children that sold their mother. I am Ireland, I am lonelier than the old woman of Barra. Okay, so now he identifies with the land, but he says, I am older than the old woman of Barra. So he's identifying Ireland, which is something like a motherland, a mother goddess. The land itself is the mother goddess, and that is the old woman of Barra. She was a mythological figure who had slept with all the kings of Ireland. So here we have that Hieros motive, which we saw in the Ochid story. You have to almost like sleep with the lady of the land in order that life shall be renewed. Great my glory, I that bore Cuchulainn. What he said about this part was Cuchulainn is the great hero, the patriarchal, you could say, hero of Ireland. And Cuchulainn said it was better to die young and achieve glory than live to old age without great recognition. And of course, that's what Pearse then, that was the motivating factor. I shall join with the land. I will wed the land like the hero Cuchulainn, and I shall be ready to die for it. Then, great my shame, my own children that sold their mother. That refers to the various historical figures, Celtic kings, small Celtic kings, that betrayed Ireland to England, not only in the olden days, but it refers also to the complacency of the people of that time, so moving up to 1916, who were satisfied with bourgeois conventionality and weren't really interested in redeeming Ireland from the rule of England. But he says, I am lonelier than the old woman of Ireland, almost sort of foretelling what was going to happen. Now, what happened is this revolution started, so the unbroken connection, wedding the old goddess of the land, having that mythological motive to free the land, eventually of course, it had a relative success in the sense that they took over various buildings, particularly in Dublin, but eventually then England suppressed the rebellion, and all 16 leaders, including Padraig Pearse, were executed. And that was the mistake of England. And because at that time, Winston Churchill said, grass does not grow over the gallows. And what happened was that the people of Ireland then, they first of all thought these were crazy people, what are they doing against the might of England? And we're quite happy being joined with England, and why should we be a republic and independent? But when they killed off all the leaders, they became martyrs. Blood was spent for the land. And that woke a new mythological energy in the people of Ireland. And so these monarchies rose up and eventually freed itself from England. So again, I just want to say that these mythologies are very old. Fairy tales are very old, but you have to look for where's the connection culturally, as I've just explained, but also in your own life. Okay, so the next PowerPoint. So what I want to say, I'll just go on, then it'll come on. What I want to say is that, so that was the landscape I grew up in. Now, another thing I think that's very important about fairy tales is that, for me at least, it's not a question of just interpreting or understanding them, but their function to make the world, your world, within and without, alive. For example, you know in fairy tales about how a stone, for example, can give a direction, can actually speak in a fairy tale. Certainly there's a host of friendly animals that tell you about what you should do and what you should avoid. Animals speak, that's quite a common notion. And then there's all kinds of magical objects like wells and trees, and of course you get all the others, the witches and so forth. But I'm just saying that I think that food chains is a typical example, where you start with plants a seed, and then the beanstalk grows up to the heavens, and it connects the earth with these giants above, and he has to go up and down this. So it's connecting, as it were, the upper world and the lower world. Actually, that has a shamanistic significance, but we'll go into that later. So what I want to say is that fairy tales make the world come alive. And I think that fairy tales represent perhaps what's maybe the oldest religion of humankind, animism. In animism, everything is imbued with a sacred noumena, a sacred atmosphere. A god may be embodied in a tree or a stone, or nymphs may be embodied in the rivers. So that nature itself is not just a biological entity to be developed in our times, but is an embodiment of a mysterious power that underlines all existence. In earlier cultures, you'll find many examples of this. In Ireland, it's called Neart. There's Dao in China, Kami in Japan, Shintoism, or the mana personality. So there's this sort of underlying energy, and that's when you come involved with a fairy tale, all the figures are malleable. So a fox can become a human, a frog can become a human, or a princess can be changed into stone, a figure of stone. So it's all sort of like, where's the energy in the fairy tale? Where's that energy that transforms all the figures, or part of the figures in the tale? And I think this is this ancient view that there's somehow behind everything an underlying energy in you, in me, not only in our friends and in our families, but also in animals and in inanimate objects. It's a cosmos that is alive and changing. Again, I'm still waiting for that PowerPoint, but if not, I'll just go on. Oh, no. So actually, you could almost say that fairy tales are, using a quote from D.H. Lawrence, who was very much involved in this sort of underlying vital energy behind everything. You could call them a cardiograph of a life that is lived, or inversely, it sensitizes us to the deadness of inauthentic existence. And that's what imagination does when it's activated by fairy tales. It's like you suddenly see things from a different perspective, that anything can have a numinous significance that has a vitality that makes you aware of things, that brings new life and new, oops, going off again. Okay, sorry about these things. I forget to bang it at times. I know that this is where. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is to give you an example. I mean, I'm going into the technique either, depending on the time, I think we just might have time later on. I didn't want to get too involved in the technique of psychodrama, but I'll introduce an example now of how one fairy tale works in a psychodramatic setting. But I just wanted to mention those things about why I'm interested in psychodrama, the landscape, the Irish background, but also the belief that fairy tales have an inherent vitality to them, a vitality that underlines all existence. I think that might be what Jung calls the self. The self is not just one figure, one image, but an underlying energy that manifests in a diversity of images. It's the entire unconscious, you could say. That sometimes with the self figures, it becomes centered at a core point, and then all the other parts are connected, but those are rare moments of life. But generally, it's just good when you're reading fairy tales, you try to see how do I connect with the Tao of the fairy tale, the Kami, the Nayat of the fairy tale. Okay, so now I'm going to give you an example of a fairy tale drama that I did, and I'm choosing this one. It's called Dame Holla or Mother Holla, depending on what translation there is. Why I choose this one, first of all, is because it's the one fairy tale that I've used in large groups. So sometimes there's 60, 70 group people who attend this. In a university in Georgia, I did it the last time. And it also, I think, has a sort of a significance that is more collective. Next time or later on today, I don't think I'll have to have it later on, I'll give you an example of how it works on an individual psyche. But this tale is one that is very helpful to outline a kind of the collective, some general collective significance that might it have for the groups. You see, when I work with psychodrama, I usually work with candidates from our institute, and all of them are in analysis. So, and because psychodrama is very, very powerful, full of this sort of vital Nayat energy, you have to be careful, because who's going to pick up the bits if someone just is left alone, the weekend is over, and they go off and God knows what happens. But here in Zurich, because everybody who I know in the psychodrama sessions are in analysis, I know they'll be picked up together. I do as much as I can in the weekend, but you don't ever know what happens afterwards. So when I go traveling and go to places where there's no, maybe not even an analyst, as in Georgia, then I'm very careful to make sure that the theme and the enactment of the theme has a general significance. So I don't go too much into the person, the psychology of the person, because that might be just too much. Okay, so now I'm going to read you the Mother Holla, but I want that slide, that PowerPoint. I have it on PowerPoint. Where are you, PowerPoint? You've got to tell me where it is. But I'll have to. So the only thing is now I'll have to read it. No, we'll have to forget. So, oh, I forgot about that one. Yeah, here we are. Great, thank you. Right on. So Mother Holla is a story about a deprived young girl, Gold Maria, a kind of Cinderella figure, whose wicked stepmother treats her like a slave. Her life is one of drudgery. She falls into a magic well and enters then, well, actually, I'll just say it. So what happens is that she has to do some embroidery for this wicked stepmother. And as she's doing the embroidery, she pricks her finger and the blood happens. So she tries to dip her finger into the well to clean it, but then the mother's instrument. I forget the name of it. The thread, not the thread. The thing that turns. Oh God, I forgot. Anyhow, it's the spool. The spool drops down into the well. So she goes back home and she says, "Mother, I was working and doing all this," and she just do all the dirty work of the home. She's a real Cinderella figure. But unfortunately, your spool dropped into the well. Well, Mother is furious. She says to that girl, "You go down and jump into that well and get it out." So the poor girl returns, looks down into the deep well and thinks, "Oh my God, should I go in there or not? Maybe I'll never come out again." But she's really frightened of the punishment she will receive at home. So she closes her eyes, jumps into the well, goes down, 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 down. And then suddenly, as she's going down, she falls asleep. And then wakes up and she sees she's surrounded by a beautiful landscape. So she looks around, there's flowers on the fields, the trees are in blossoms, everything is so wonderfully fruitful. And then she starts to walk in this very beautiful place and comes to a stove. And the stove is baking bread. And the bread calls out from the stove, "Hey, take us out, take us out. We'll burn it, we're baked already." So this little Gold Mary opens the stove and takes out the bread and puts it all neatly ready. Then she goes on and comes under an apple tree. And the apples call out, pick us, otherwise we'll fall onto the ground and be bruised. Pick us, pick us." So she picks the apples and makes them into a nice pie. Goes on and comes to this strange little house. And she knocks on the door, and out comes a strange woman with large teeth. And imagine the delight of people who act that role. And so this lady says, "Don't be frightened, don't look at me, you may come in." So she comes into the house, and she's called Mother Holle, said, "Now you have to work for me. You have to clean the house, you have to cook, and you have to shake the mattress. And when you shake the mattress, the duvet maybe today what we call, snow will fall on the earth." So Goldmarie is delighted. She gets lots of food, she's well looked after, and she works very hard. But then after a while, she gets a bit homesick. She says, "This isn't the place I really belong to. I want to go home." So Mother Holle notices that and says, "Very well, you've done very well. So I will take you to the home." And so she takes her to this gate. And as the gate opens, suddenly Mary is showered with gold. And she comes back home. The cock cries, "Cock-a-doodle-doo, cock-a-doodle-doo. Goldmarie is home anew." And then the mother looks at Goldmarie and says, "My God, what's happened to you? All this gold, we've been working our asses off, and look what you're bringing back. How did you do all this?" So she told the mother about this. In the meantime, the other sister, who's known as Pechmarie in German, you could say Black Mary or Sooty Mary, hears this, and she's very lazy and doesn't want to do the work and says, "Oh my God, but I want the gold." So off she goes and says, "Mother, just hold on a moment, we're going to be rich. This is the money we always wanted." So off she goes, dives into the well, passes sees all the beautiful landscape, passes the stove with the baking bread. The bread calls out to her, "Take us out, take us out." So, "Why should I take it out? I'll get dirty. It's all burnt in there." "No, thanks." Passes the apple tree. "Oh, shake us. We want to be taken and put into piles." Says, "Oh no, one of you might fall on my head." Comes to the house of Dame Holle, and she says, "Come in," and explains, "You have to work with me, and then everything shall be well." So Lazy Mary, Black Mary, Sooty Mary works as hard as she can, but she's quite exhausted very soon afterwards. She's not used to working. And then the first day she does okay, the second day she does a bit less, and the third day she falls asleep and doesn't want to work anymore. And she says, "I'm homesick, I want to go home." So this old lady, takes her back home, and as she passes the gate, black pitch rains down on Mary. And she comes home, and the mother is shocked. "My God, Mary, what's happened to you? What's happened to you?" And tries to scrub it off, but it doesn't come off. And that's more or less the end of the tale. Now, So what happens is when I am working with a larger group, usually each figure in the tale is embodied by a person. So, and of course it shows, so I ask who wants first of all to be the mother? And then I warm that, using psychodramatic, I warm up. So I get behind that person and say, mother, I'm the mother. I'm very proud of my real daughter, Lazy Mary, and this, whose mother I don't know, Gold Mary, she'll do all the dirty work. And she's useful because we don't have to work, and so you'll just get her to do everything. And then somebody takes on the Gold Mary. She's the heroine who has to go through all this ordeal. And then also, when we're warming up Black Mary, she's the lazy one, is used to being served by Gold Mary, taking an easy life, not working, and just wants luxury, wants money. And as one person said, this is a modern, a Paris Hilton kind of person. Then we warm up the well. And in this case, when I did it in this university, there were 3 people who did the well, right? So they were all around the well. And I said to them, look, you are a kind of liminal object between the family of Gold Mary and this strange Baba Yaga, great mother, Dame Holla figure, with that world. That's very fruitful, fertile, and beautiful. So they got it. Once you sort of give the cue, the fairy tale cue, you're really actually cueing them into some kind of archetypal pattern. So we have, first of all, the home scene, then we have a liminal space, and then we have this other world, also embodied. First of all, the bread that calls out, I'm baked. And then I also say, well, what is bread? I mean, how can we think of bread? Well, bread is like the source of life. Bread gives nourishment. It's very fundamental. So anybody who takes care of this side of life will be physically healthy and well, will be enriched. The bread of life, we hear about the Bible. Something being connected to vitality and life and movement. Then they pass the apples. And if you think of Eve, the apples, you think of apples that are long connected with eros, with love. So again, we have something very feminine, the feminine, the sensuality, even the sexuality of life, the enjoyment of life. And so you can see that that also is like an archetypal center. Finally, to come to this great mother figure, Baba Yaga, who is, so the heroine, both Gold Mary and Black Mary have a kind of ambivalent relationship. She's got big teeth, will she eat me up? But she's also very hospitable and is friendly if one works. So what happens there is that, so we just say, well, look, this is not a human being, because even in the fairy tale, Dame Holla controls the season. You heard that when the bed is shaken, snow will fall on the ground. So that's like warming up an archetype, a lady of the seasons, Mother Nature who controls the seasons. So pretty larger than life figure. No wonder why you feel a bit ambivalent. And then comes the return, that's easy. And the cock that crows, well, that's often a symbol of dawn, of a new day. One could even say announcing perhaps a new consciousness, and the return. So then so that's more or less what happens. So when the heroine decides to is ready, so the main, what we call in psychodrama, the protagonist, the main figure, she goes through just the fairy tale. She can be quite spontaneous, because as I said, it's not too personal. So what happens is, very often, as I've done this several times, is first of all, is the sort of sense of abandonment, the sense of neglect that Gold Mary feels at home. And the other side, you could say the shadow, Black Mary, is just, I want money, I want you to work for me, the lazy side of life. I mean, I would say this is primarily, I'll just say primarily, a woman's psychology, because there's all women in it, But of course, it equally works for men because men have an anima and it can be just as inspiring and as hardworking as a woman, but can also be just as lazy and as phlegmatic as a black Mary. So you have to think of these are two sides maybe of the same person. So usually then the fairy tale advances and there's some kind of argument, but then Golden Mary is lost, and it is quite spontaneous. So she goes off alone and thinks, what shall she do? And looks into the well, and she begins to speak to the well because no one will listen to her at home. So she goes and speaks to the well. What can you offer me? So it's already a little moving away from the fairy tale, but it's very spontaneous. And the well then, because it's archetypally cued in, says, you have to be careful. If you cross this boundary, you don't know what will happen. Are you ready to face the challenges of the underworld, a world that maybe you don't know about? And so there are maybe even 3 people doing the well, 3 voices. Do you feel strong enough? Do you want to face the unknown? Or someone says, why do you want to change your life? Oh yeah, of course it's miserable. Yeah, well, of course, well, maybe I can offer hope here. This is another world, and you might see something quite more different. So you can see already the dialogue's happening, and some kind of transformation is possible. I don't say, we don't pressure to have transformation. Then she goes on, takes the dive, sleeps, dreams. This might be like a dream, a liminal dream. Now you're moving into another realm. What's going to happen? Feel ambivalent, even frightened. But then sees, well, there's more to life than what I've experienced. Sometimes dreams bring tremendous hope, as this fairy tale, in the sense of it's a life of drudgery, and suddenly you dream of a beautiful landscape and beautiful women or men, and everything is alive, so that no matter how bad you've been treated, the unconscious can compensate that life and bring new healing and hope. So then she comes, and then the bread starts to talk to her. You know, look at the nourishment in life. Okay, you always got the crumbs back home, but I'm nature, and I can offer you much more. Get out of that place as quick as you can, and take the challenge of life. Move out, and you might discover there's a lot more nourishment to be found in what you don't know than the life you've known. And then the apples say, yeah, look, you know, you're a woman. You've got a beautiful body. You have a beautiful heart. There's sensuality. Now look back home. I mean, your sister there just wants food and nice clothes, but you know that doesn't satisfy you. You want love. You want relationship. So, you know, so something is moving on here. And finally she comes to the Baba Yaga's house, the Dame Holle, and the teeth, of course, are frightening because here's a huge part, but she knows she has to work. She has to work to really achieve something. And is, of course, amazed that when you shake the bed, nature responds in some way. So there's a kind of synchronicity between the Mary and the movements of nature. She's now, as it were, cued into probably something like a feminine self-figure that brings winter, and indeed that was her life back home, but also can bring sunshine, spring, and summer. So almost like, although it doesn't pronounce that exactly, but in this dialogue, once you get into it, you can see that here everything is possible. If I just now stay connected to this self-force, this self-energy, that things might be quite different. So then, but the homesickness comes, telling maybe that I don't want to stay in a mythological landscape. I want to change my life. I want to go back there now from this new experience of the nourishment of life, of the sensuality of life, of the power of life. I want to go back and change my life. Gold rains upon her, gold, the alchemical gold, the highest value, the shining, the most highest value. So in some way, she's now connected to something deeper, something more central, you could say, in life, something more genuine, real values, gold, symbol of real values, alchemical values. Finally comes back home and shows this, but the tale doesn't know what happens to her afterwards. It doesn't say that, but you know she's got some power now and that her life is going to change. And that's what people feel when they do this enactment. And of course, then we look at then Black Mary doing all that and everything fails. Now, why again I choose this tale is first was an experience of some transformation, but on a general level, Secondly, I'm just going to read something. Just hold on a moment. I want to say, we experienced some internet slowdown at John Hill's connection. We will continue the monitor, but do unfortunately not have direct control of the local internet. Hopefully we'll pick up shortly. So now, I don't know what I can do about that. I hope you can hear me, at least. But if not, it's best to switch off and then we just try again. But I'm going to just keep going until I hear something. Okay, so what then in the discussion afterwards, because afterwards, so something has really happened. There's been a splitting process. One part of Mary, shall we say, we see them as two parts of one man, has through her work achieved some kind of strength and power and awareness of herself as a woman, as an independent, and the other is still lost in, as one person says, I forget the name, but yeah, some as lost in the blackness of life, the blackness, the darkness of life, is the unconsciousness. Because they didn't take the opportunity to connect with the other world, with Baba Yaga, with the sensuality of life. Instead, they opted for a life like of a Paris Hilton. I don't say Paris Hilton is like that because I don't know her, but that sort of image that gets projected. So then, to conclude, then, when we discuss this tale, we talk about its general significance. That it's a tale about ecology, I think, taking care of nature. If we just abuse it, use it for our own ends, use it just simply for financial reasons and so forth, then we lose something fundamental in ourselves. We split ourselves. We become seduced by, as what Jung would say, the 1,001 distractions of material comfort. And I think that's a bit the story of our times. That's why I use this tale, because it has an overall significance of an example of you really have to work with the unconscious to stand outside of the collective trends, be in connection with the gold, the center, the feminine center in Baba Yaga, or Dame Holle, and then be also aware of the constant falling back into material satisfaction. Because then in that way we just support the trend. We support the uprooting of trees, the warming of the climate, the destruction of indigenous cultures. I often tell this tale when at the end of these kind of enactments, where I often think of the so-called Comoro people of West Papua. For the Comoro people, their mountains are the breasts of the mother of the land, and the rivers are the milk flowing from these breasts. And then an international company came and discovered, I think, copper and a certain amount of gold and different metals. And so they started to scrape off the tops of these hills, and the rivers became poisoned. And so the people saw that their ancestral connection to this land, also an embodiment of the ancestors, also an embodiment of their ancestors and of their mother, that her breasts were cut off and the milk from her breasts became poisoned. And so they had to abandon their land. A lot of them moved into the cities and became criminals, drug addiction. I don't say all of them, but this has been just a problem of that culture. As an example of what we do when we destroy the life of and the cultures of indigenous peoples, we're destroying something in ourselves, something that we hold as valuable, a connection to our ancestors, to nature, or I would say even to the spirits in nature. So it's a nice way to round off the tale. Instead of going too much personally into it, it was enacted. And one of the largest, I'll end with sort of what it's like when you see this tale. So when it's laid out in a large room, so we have the circle of the 60 people around, and then we have one section is home life, Mother, Gold Mary, Black Mary. And that's like the realm of consciousness. On the other side of the room, we have the Baba Yaga, Dame Holla, the bread and the trees and beautiful nature. What life can be, the unconscious, the potential that is in us all. And in the middle, we have this liminal space, the well. Are we going to jump into that well or not? Are we going to face those challenges? Not to jump in too quickly, to reflect on when is the right time to really work with the unconscious, to work with that inner potential that can promise us a better life. So when you actually visibly see this laid out in a room, it has quite an effect. It's almost like consciousness, liminality, and the unconscious are all present, all visibly present. Very much mirroring what we would call the old initiation rites, which are made up of three factors: separation from the old, from the conventional; liminality, being in a space betwixt and betweens; change. It's also in Bardo, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the world of illusions, the world of facing what's real and what's not real. And then finally into the unconscious and all the figures of the unconscious. What is life's potential? And the heroine journeys through these, as also the shadow. Both of them journey through these. So you actually see a process of individuation, linking these, for better or for worse, one can say, linking these various edifices. Various, you could say, edifices of the unconscious. So now I've finished Dame Holla. I don't know if somebody would want to ask, or should I just move on? I'm not quite sure if the connection is working. I'll just take a moment's break and see what I can...
Hi, John. The connection was slow. The connection was slow for a little bit, and your voice was getting kind of choppy. It's gotten much better, though, in the last half hour or so. So I would say just keep going, forward with it. Before we do the final seminar, Ryan has some ideas just to optimize your speed a little bit in the house. But I'll talk to you about that, later. But I think we're pretty good.
I might have to change rooms the next time, but I'm sorry to apologize to the audience for that.
Yeah, we tried it before. It worked fine. Just this time it was slower for some reason. But you're fine if you want to keep going, or if Murray wants to add anything. And we'll keep an eye out for questions, too.
Okay. So please interfere if you want to. Spirit in the Bottle is the next one. What is the Spirit in the Bottle? Which is already Murray has done. I could do that one maybe, because it's an example of a more personal psychology where it's involved. And that was in a group where, and then maybe I'll start next time with all the techniques and so forth. But the personal psychology.
Good question, John.
Yeah, you have a question. I have to speak loud because I can't quite hear you.
My question is, you make this distinction between personal and not personal. I don't quite understand that. Isn't the Frau Holla story also personal? I mean,
of course it is. But what I said was, because I'm working in a group who I don't know, I don't want to go too personally into it. You see? And I will give an example. Well, I could actually do that now. I could give an example of the same fairy tale, but worked on a personal level. And probably like yourself, I find that there's a constant interaction between the personal psychology and the archetypal psychology. And that's one of the great things of psychodrama or fairy tale drama. So when I ask somebody, for example, would they like to take a role in the tale? I say to them, look, you have to feel it. This has to touch some way your personal life. what you've experienced maybe with your father, with your mother, etc. And that sort of brings the tale alive. And then in the fairy tale, you have the archetypal background. So first of all, what we do is we do the actual tale that constellates the more archetypal, the fairy tale. And then I let one person take what we call the protagonist, one role, and they enact this role. And sometimes they decide to do just straightforward psychodrama, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, and so forth. But very often they choose a role in the fairy tale. And then they kind of, because something's being activated, and so they act this role in the fairy tale, and it turns out to be, the fairy tale has been a constellating factor, but then something personal takes over, and then we try to, again, in the course of the fairy tale, go back to the level of the archetypal. So it's constantly weaving the personal and the collective. So I'm going to now go on to that story, give an example of Mother Holle. Let me just see if I can do it. Let's just check that. Yeah.
Well, also, I would like to.
So you all know
how to integrate these two girls. I mean, you have the Black Mary and the Good Mary, good girl and bad girl. They belong to us all, right? And how do they ever come together?
Yeah. Well, I can't find it. Let me just see it here. Well, I just have to tell it sort of like from memory. Okay. So that was an example. Why I said that I emphasized more the collective, because it's out of respect for sort of the individual. I don't want to, in a large setting, go too deeply into the personal psychology. However, I did do the same fairy tale, so now you know it, I don't have to say it again, Mother Holle, with, in a fairy tale drama setting. There were about 12 participants. All of them were in analysis. And so we started with the fairy tale, and 4 people, I think, actually enacted the tale just the way it is. So that sort of becomes the constellating factor. And then I asked then one of the 4 who would like to do it. Only one person can be a protagonist in what I call an improvised enactment. And so eventually this woman decided, yes, I'd be wanting to do that. And so I kind of, first of all, helped her to warm up. Where is she? And she chose, I want to be in the fairy tale. So as Mary, and just see what happens. So then I said, well, what else would you like to do? Is there something moving inside of you, looking back at your life, that you'd like to work on? And she said, yes, something is there in the background. It's very difficult for me to talk about it, but I feel I really must. And she says it's something to do with loss, and then suddenly the image of her brother came up. And so, so she said, I want you to set up the well. So the well was set up with 3 people, if I remember correctly. And she just then started a dialogue with the well, right? And so the well is like, began to say, well, what do you want from me, and so on. And then she said, I want to know where my brother is. My brother died. I think it was through an accident. And I always feel guilty about that. I've always felt, he's lost to me. He was the most important person for me. And so the well says, well, I can help you maybe. I can help you make a connection, because in this other world where I enter, people don't die. They're alive in some way. And so through the well, she could begin to talk with her brother. And what happened was that somebody was chosen. She chose someone from the audience, who was the brother, and then she warmed him up the way the brother was for her. And then through the well, which was between them, the brother could talk with her and say, you don't need to worry. You don't need to feel guilty. All is well where I am. And so she began to feel, yes, this brings happy memories back to me. I must not just be lost in my mourning. I've done that. I must not just feel guilty that maybe I should have looked after the brother a bit better and maybe things could have turned out or get a closer relationship to him. And so you can see now how in that sort of simple example of where through an archetypal image, the well, as a liminal space, she could begin to have some hope that life would go on beyond the well, you could say, and that some kind of healing began to take place in her own soul, so that a more healthier attitude towards her brother began to evolve. And that was a very deep fairy tale. I've made it a bit short, a very deep enactment. And I mean, I wouldn't like to do that in a group of 60 people. At least I just feel a little bit uneasy in case it activated just too much and went wrong. I mean, with this person, she was very mature. She really needs to work on this quest of the lost brother. And then, as you know, in fairy tales, after the enactment, they have to de-roll, and then they come back and sit down as part of the group. And the next stage comes from sharing, psychodrama, in the sense of everybody in the group, or more or less everyone, begins to say similar things. They don't say, you did this, or this means that. They say, yes, I lost my sister. And I can remember, and then they go into the story about what that meant for that loss, or the loss of the mother, or whatever. So that then what happens is there's a sort of a support for this tragedy. There's a support for the person who was willing to do this psychodrama, that she began to feel that I'm not alone in this. This group is becoming cohesive and becoming very supportive. And I see that, this person and that person and that person, they've had experiences about this, about a loss that simply keeps haunting them. They can't relax. They can't accept it in some way, something natural. I mean, we're all going to die. And so they began this working through of this sort of not understanding, why did my brother go? Why did I'm still caught in that? No, it began to loosen, and people began to, with a lot of tears, share their experiences of death, their experiences of loss. And so when you experience that in a group, it becomes very therapeutic and very helpful. And who knows, it might never have happened with, if we just interpreted the fairy tale, or without that psychodrama, without that. But it was like a unique experience where, because people didn't talk about that in our family, apparently just didn't talk about it, didn't have that sensitivity maybe to talk about it. But very often in a Jungian group of analysts or students of analysis, that this kind of healing factor can happen.
I think,
did that answer your question?
Yeah, it sounds
very much. What?
It sounds like what happens is that you allow for creativity, something new to enter, and really take it into a whole different direction than what might be suggested in the fairy tale itself. The fairy tale brings some energy together, offers some direction, maybe some symbols, and then from there you can go in many different directions depending on the issues of people in the group who you're working with at the time.
Yeah, that's very true. And a lot depends on the choice of tale. You see, before psychodrama, I usually invite people to make one preliminary meeting and tell them to be very careful of the choice. Something has to be constellated in you. And very often, it's something from the original home life. It can be an abusive mother or a neglecting mother or a cruel father or whatever it was. And then they'll choose a fairy tale with a cruel father and a weak mother, like Hansel and Gretel. And then they will, I can remember that being once played, and actually it was Snow White, which is most unusual. So Snow White, as you know, there's this queen who looks at the mirror on the wall and says, "Who's the most beautiful in the world?" And the mirror answers, "It's not you anymore, queen, it's your daughter, Snow White." So she tries to do everything to kill Snow White. Now, so you think, well, now what's going to happen in an improvised actment? Well, what happened there was that there was a woman in the group who says, "I want to play a role. This fairy tale has turned me on." And then she took the role of the wicked queen who wants to kill Snow White, not at all interested in lovely Snow White. And then what did she start with? She says, "Where's my husband?" Now, it's often the missing person in the tale that's the most important. And then she went into a whole thing about, I was left with this daughter, with his daughter, who didn't even belong to me. She was my stepdaughter, and I had to look after her. And my husband just left me. So, of course, I wanted to destroy anything to do with him. And, of course, that was echoing something in her life that she really had experienced. But it was put in the framework of the tale, which was also a certain protection. So it was very personal, especially that came out later in the discussion. But in the tale, she felt somehow, well, why can't we be a wicked queen, especially if I have been abandoned and left alone with somebody else's daughter? I don't want to look after her. So it sort of like was a surprise, a complete surprise about what happened. And that's one of the most important things about fairy tales, is that I always say to them, look, when you're choosing a tale, you have to go down into yourself and you have to feel something's turned on. And then I can guarantee you it'll work. And so then, just to finish off on that tale, usually there are several scenes. So the first scene was disaster. Get the hell out of here, the daughter. I want to go off and look for my husband. And then I can't remember all the details, but one of the scenes was she was an old woman, so she wanted to see herself 30 years later. And then she sort of said, well, I've seen a lot in life now, and maybe I was just too hard on that daughter of mine. And I felt always guilty because I wasn't really loving enough for taking care of enough of her. So, I'm sorry, Snow White, for giving you a hard time. And then the tale ended. The psychodrama ended. And in quite a different way than one would expect. But somehow, so that's some of the techniques we can use. We can always shove the time around so that people reach this level of reflection on the action. It's not just pure action, acting out, but if you put somebody 10, 20 years later, they start to reflect what really happened there.
Well, it seems like what you're doing is using fairy tales as a kind of metaphorical setting that distances one from the personal at first, and then kind of allows the personal to get involved, but in a slow and in a safer way than just jumping into the personal, and extend the personal issues into the archetypal and the metaphorical direction.
Exactly, it's that
creative solutions maybe to come.
Yeah, that's right. And it comes to my mind now. I think I did that once, and then with this person, and then there was a middle scene, I think, if I remember correctly, of the dwarfs. Now, you see, that's why the fairy tale is wonderful, because all these figures have a role to play. So the dwarfs came and said to her, look, when you sort of threw out that daughter of yours, the daughter of somebody else, and your husband left you, here were we, your animus was pretty small, right? So we want to grow up and don't want to be just small little creatures who just run around the place and dig holes everywhere and get very frustrated. So you can suddenly see that this was also something, oh yes, my God, I did have a dwarf attitude towards that daughter. I didn't see her for who she was and who she could be and who I could be. And maybe my animus needs to grow up. So there's often, and that's the point of directing a fairy tale. When you see the fairy tale, you've got a whole lot of figures, archetypal figures who you can call upon, right? Who you can call upon when somebody is in difficulty. So when, for example, Gold Mary in the fairy tale Mother Holle is down and out and says, what will I do? I'm hopeless here. Then somewhere in the background, I have activated Mother Holla, who says, show your teeth. You've got more strength than just you get going into despair because of this woman bullying you around the place. And just that calling out, she knows, okay, Mother Holla is there. So the whole, with various figures on stage, as it were, they can be activated. And I have a special technique so that the protagonist, the main person, in this case Mary, is protected, is that so that not everyone is talking at the same time, so that when they come within, let's say, a meter or a yard of each other, then they're activated. So someone will say, well, why don't you go and ask Dame Holla, when you feel so down and bullied by your mother, what does she think of it? And then this archetypal energy is activated and says, show your teeth, show your teeth. And then that's like, oh God, that's there too. That's in me somewhere. So maybe that sort of gives you some idea of how this thing can come alive, and it's this energy it's just choosing the right people at the right time.
Yes, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could do this kind of work with the leaders of nations, and you take the Germans and the Greeks, the northern and the southern, the Mediterranean people, and you put them together and see if they could work out a solution. Such different attitudes toward life, such different attitudes toward work. Do you think a psychodrama?
Yes, yes,
could be a creative solution?
Would be. It'd take a lot of work to get these people into it, but why not? You know, talking about the North and the South, I used to do psychodrama in Turin, in Italy, right? And you see, one of the great things about psychodrama is you have to have an antagonist. You can't just be too loving, and you have to have someone who challenges you, like the dwarf, for example, or like the Baba Yaga, who challenges the mother back home. But the problem with the Italians were that they couldn't stand the conflict. So when there was a big fight, as it were, then suddenly they broke down and said, oh, ti amo, ti amo, ti amo, I love you, I love you, I love you. And so the whole drama was lost. So I'd say, no, stop, go back. This has to be fought through. This is not just a matter about love. And then when I worked with a lot of the Swiss, they really went at each other. So I had to say, okay, now we better just take it easy. We don't want to have blows here on stage. Yeah. So again, it's a sensitivity to culture. It's very important.
Yeah. Well, thank you, John. I think you really did bring us beautifully into your own culture, the Irish culture, and set the stage for your interest in fairy tales and this magical world that fairy tales bring us, that Jungians have been so engaged in, interpreting, involved with, using in various different ways. And I think, as far as I know, you're the first Jungian analyst to take fairy tales into psychodrama. Do you know of others who have done this with fairy tales?
I think there are. There's bibliodrama, I know, and there's mythodrama. I've done also mythodrama, but I haven't heard it in Switzerland. I'm sure, you know, in this world, everything is somewhere in some corner or not. By the way, I just want to say to the audience a little bit of magic. You know, the connections are broken down sometimes. But I know when I wave my hand between the connector and the screen here, it's reestablished. So I can hear you better. Sometimes you switch off, but as soon as I wave my hand in that direction where the Wi-Fi is, it connects. So a little bit of fairy tale magic here, even on screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love your animation, John. You are a very animated man, and the hands and the voice and the passion. It's a wonderful energy too, and I think it was such a beautiful connection with Murray and John, as just the energies and the directions and the depth, both in very different ways, but both very deep men. Really appreciate your thoughts, John. I kept wishing I could be a fly on the wall of one of your psychodrama gatherings. That would be such a phenomenal experience, and I know it's hard with all the legalities and confidentiality, but if we could ever to have just a camera that people knew was there and could help us understand firsthand or experience. I know, all of us would love to somehow, even if it was a reenacted, not even a true actual one, I would love to see firsthand what that experience is. That is such a great tool that you bring to the Jungian community. We really, really appreciate that. With that, it's 1:30 our time, 7:30 Zurich time. I do want to mention I typed out a brief chat message about that, but we did have some slowdown in John's connection about halfway through. It was never horrible, but it kind of caught some of your sentences and then slowed them down. I was worried if that continued, it would have been quite difficult. But then the last half, it seemed to be pretty good. Ryan Deegan has some ideas about that, John. He's going to call you later, and we're going to reconfigure slightly your space better for next time.
Yeah, and I will move to the other room. That's all.
It might be that, or actually an Ethernet cord connecting the two might solve the problem as well. It might be a Wi-Fi issue we're thinking. Even though it worked fine in the test, sometimes that's not the case later. But we'll fix that before the next one. So hopefully, God willing, the internet will be just fine next time. December 6th will be our final, and John Hill and Murray will be joining us for that one as well. We are very excited to see these. Those of you that are doing continuing education, we are getting the transcripts now made of these. We were out of the loop a little bit because we lost our transcript provider, but we have that up and running again, and so you should be getting automatic transcripts fairly soon of all of the fairy tale ones with that. And if anybody wants the transcripts, those should be available for purchase and download at some point relatively soon as well. So good. Any last thought before we say goodbye, John or Murray? We appreciate your time today.
Thank you for listening, and again, until next time.
And thank you. Well, good. We will see you in a few weeks and go from there. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.